So there is no free lunch here. Yes, a few townships that collect that money that was extracted through PA 295 are certainly seeing a benefit. Everybody else pays. There is no free lunch.
Mr. Kurtz, tell everybody what PA 295 is.
Oh, that's our original renewable energy mandate bill from 2008. The latest package now adds another 5% to that mandate and apparently more. So now I'm going to talk about some things. I was not surprised to not see any pictures in the last presentation of wind turbines next to people's homes. I've never seen anybody in Lansing show what wind development actually looks like on the town and at the local level. Here's a 476-foot turbine in Ludington, Michigan, in Mason County. That's 1,139 feet back to the home. The people that live there is a man named Kerry Schindeldecker. When the turbine commenced operation, they were driven into their basement to sleep because of the noise. He's not just a kook. Despite having sued the county in advance trying to prevent this project because of the harm that was anticipated, he now has been appointed to their planning commission in Mason County and is in fact on their zoning board of appeals, so he still enjoys a high regard in that community. He moved out of that house at about a 30 or 35% loss and built a new house outside the project footprint. By the way, it's interesting that Mr. Hawkins is here from Apex. They're now proposing 600-foot turbines in Berrien and Shiawassee counties, and in fact, I have a couple folks from Shiawassee here now who are looking at that development in their communities. Point of reference, the towers on the Mackinac Bridge are 552 feet tall. And so this is what it looks like when you actually turn a township into a 50-story tall power plant. This is the new reality. It's easy to just blithely say wind, gas, solar, coal in one big sentence, but the reality is far different for the people living with it. This is in Huron County. Those were only 390-foot towers. Gratiot County, and by the way, opposition to wind is now growing in Gratiot County. For the first time ever, we have 2 townships that are actively seeking to adopt restrictive zoning regulations to prevent any more wind development there, and DTE is looking at 5 other townships. We know that opposition is growing there as well. Missaukee County, welcome home. This is what wind development looks like. And curiously, I don't have a nighttime picture. One of the biggest complaints about wind development is you look out across Huron County. These folks can attest to this fact. See several hundred flashing red lights all night long for the next 20 years in unison. It's not what they grew up with.
Yeah, as my wife says, the only thing worse would be if they weren't in unison.
And there's some debate about that. They've tried it both ways. So we know folks would say, but would you rather live next to a nuclear power plant? People don't like that either, right? Well, let's look at the Fermi 2 plant, 1,100 megawatts. It sits on, I don't know, a square mile, something like that. You can kind of see the one home there. I suppose it's a half mile away or so. 1,100 megawatts of capacity. You could replace that with wind turbines. It'd be rather simple, though costly. You put 2 Vestas V100 turbines in every square mile from Toledo to Detroit to Ann Arbor to equal the annualized output from that nuclear power plant. But you would still have to have 1,100 megawatts of gas-fired generation because in July and August, wind has a curious phenomenon of when demand is high, wind doesn't spin. Put in another perspective, 36 square miles or 1 township of these turbines produces on average the same amount of electricity you can generate from this semi-trailer mounted gas turbine that fits inside your average dairy barn. It's because wind is a very diffuse energy source. And I've heard Apex's former representatives say that we could easily reach 40% wind in the state of Michigan without any grid issues. Well, just let's be clear, that would require 3,600 square miles solid with wind turbines to hit that percentage. What's my point? By way of comparison, every coal, gas, and nuclear power plant in the state of Michigan would fit neatly in the footprint of only 1 or 2 townships. We would have to cover 100 townships solid with wind turbines, yet all those other power plants would have to be there or converted to gas. So it's not a question of gas or coal plant impacts or wind. It now becomes both across a tremendous region. I've done the math on it. It's 3,600 square miles. The installed cost for those turbines at 40% would be $30 billion. And that expenditure would need to be repeated on a 20-year rolling cycle because turbines only last about 20 years. There'd be more transmission, more gas-fired generators. Now, let's talk about this in-state mandate. I'm glad this came up. I tried repeatedly over the past few years, as a number of you are brand new to me, I presume we're new legislators here, but I testified a number of times on the in-state mandate. And I don't understand where the drive came to put that back into the legislation at the last minute. Governor Snyder's office made it clear that it's not legal. Senator Knopf made it clear to me in open hearing that it's illegal and unconstitutional. Representative Nesbitt understood that as well. I don't understand who was left that was even a stakeholder in that, unless perhaps it's our incumbent utilities. And I won't go on too much, but the bottom line is the state doesn't have the legal right to meddle in interstate commerce, and electricity generation by definition is interstate commerce. So our in-state mandate is a violation of the Dormant Commerce Clause of the United States Constitution, yet it persists. Now, let's take a look at wind resources. Here's our problem. We talk about how wind is cheap and getting cheaper. Look at the map. Purple is great wind. Yellow and orange ain't so good. I'll zoom in. Here's a comparison with Iowa and Michigan. Iowa's best wind, our best wind is their worst wind. And as a result, it's a high degree of correlation between wind speed and generation potential. It's roughly the cube of the wind speed. Every turbine that we built in the state of Michigan, on average, would produce twice as much electricity if it were just located in Oklahoma or Iowa. Now, this is an important number. There are a lot of numbers discussed, but we know what electricity is worth in our grid region. $25 a megawatt hour. So keep that in the back of your mind. That's the average wholesale price of electricity right now for the last year in MISO. Here's our power purchase agreement prices. This is from the National Renewable Energy Lab. And each bubble represents a power purchase agreement or a 20-year wind contract for wind energy starting back in 1996. I've superimposed upon that chart the red lines which show Michigan's published renewable energy contracts. So yes, you can see the red line starts at about $110 a megawatt hour and drops in just 2 years by magic to below $60. Well, that's one of the most expensive wind contracts ever recorded in the United States at that price. In fact, one of them is in Delta County in the Garden Peninsula project. Suddenly in 2 years it's dropped $60. Well, look, the rest of the country, the yellow bubbles, if you will, our Great Lakes contracts, were already well cheaper than that. There is a learning curve, but my suspicion is that the learning curve was with our regulators, because I think they were sold a bill of goods. And none of those contracts is getting cheaper. They all stay flat for 20 years, so we're not really gaining much. And you will see that the cost curve did not stop at $45. It's in fact shot up sharply. Let's take a look at our published power purchase agreement prices in Michigan. You see that they've been essentially flat from 2012 to 2015. There is not an ever dropping price point. And it's interesting that Oklahoma has come up. Here's what they're paying for wind in bid into Missouri from the very windy states. Apex is listed here, $21 a megawatt hour, $17 a megawatt hour. Our average is $76 a megawatt hour in Michigan. There is no region in-state advantage for us to force all this wind energy to come only from in the state. We're at a 300% price disadvantage compared to our windy peers to the west.
Kevin, I want to jump in right there on that question. So your point is, you've already said you think the provision of law, which I agree with you, I thought I understood that was coming out, the Michigan-only mandate. But if we limit it only to Michigan, not only do you believe it violates the Federal Commerce Clause, but it's costing us a lot more to get renewable energy if it has to be built in Michigan.
Absolutely.
Like Steelcase, the guy that's doing Steelcase, they're getting it from Oklahoma.
They did contract with
windier, where the wind comes whipping down the plain.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It only stands. Look, we can dam up the Grand River and have, and they've also dammed up the Mississippi River. So yes, you can mandate hydro in both places, but I can tell you who's going to have a competitive price advantage, and it's not the Grand River. And now we need to take a look at one other point. Pine River, the DT's project in Gratiot County, where we heard laudatory things about it, is now reported at MPSC being at $60. At that price, it's the most expensive reported publicly available wind contract in the United States in 2016, because the wind there is abysmal. And here's Posner, who said, in response to a lawsuit that Attorney General Schuette had filed about Michigan not wanting to pay the socialized costs of some wind transmission project, he said, well, we're rolling our own in state so we don't need to pay for out-of-state renewable. And he says, well, unfortunately, you don't have the constitutional right to discriminate against out-of-state renewable energy. And I am going to, in the interest of time, bump it forward. So how about this idea that wind is cheaper than coal? We hear that constantly. We heard it again this morning. And it's in our annual report on PA 295. You can look that up at the MPSC website, and they have been required to publish a report every year that does a cost comparison between wind and coal, renewable energy and coal. And you see it here. They say, well, coal would be $133. The cost of all renewable projects is less than the coal guidepost rate. Here's the problem. Well, what we see is wind promoters grab that and run these headlines all across the country saying Michigan says wind is now cheaper than coal. Well, they're talking about a brand new coal plant, advanced coal with carbon capture and sequestration, which, by the way, does not exist in economic form anywhere in the United States. So how they know that that's $133 a megawatt hour is a mystery to me. But there's another more fundamental problem. Dr. Josko is one of the most eminent economists, energy economists in the United States at MIT. And he says, look, the production profiles for intermittent and dispatchable generation and the value of the electricity they produce are likely to be very different, making comparisons based on levelized cost alone meaningless. I'll give you an example. Let's say you had a 24-hour restaurant, and I think we all understand that during the breakfast time, the lunchtime, and dinner time, you see a rush in demand for staff, kitchen people serving, and so forth. And so your most valuable employees would be the ones that you can call upon when a bus full of football players comes in and the guy lives 2 minutes away, say, we got a big rush, can you come help us feed all these football players? That's a highly valuable employee because that person can show up at times of very high demand for your product. How much value would you place on an employee that says, I only show up when the weather makes it possible for me to show up, and that might most often be between midnight and 4 a.m.? Because it turns out that's the generation profile for wind most often is between midnight and 4 a.m. and not much at all in July and August. There's a tremendous difference in value of the electricity they furnish because the whole point of energy to liberate us from subsistence farming was that we get energy sources that are subject to human whim. That's what advancement looked like, and wind is the exact opposite of that. And this chart from ERCOT shows exactly that. The yellow bars at the bottom show wind availability or generation, while the demand is the bars at the top. Study after study shows that wind generation is sharply inverse to demand. That means it's a high-cost, low-value commodity.
Mr. Martis, just so you can pace yourself, if you would please wrap up in about 5 minutes, and that'll leave the remaining 15 minutes for questions from the committee.
Okay. Then I will jump very quickly. I can't go into any detail for gas. Wind is a gas price volatility hedge, except to say not once in the history of our renewable energy mandate has the price of gas ever been so high that wind has been an effective hedge against it. It has not. It's not even close. And in fact, I'll look at these two slides. There was our profile in 2014, coal, gas, nuclear. If we start to reach towards things, and obviously that's changing as plants are being retired, if we decided to go 30% wind because of wind's interaction with gas, virtually all our other generators would have to be converted to gas, presuming surrounding states adopted similar policies. My point is this, wind is tied directly to the gas market. The more wind you have, the more gas generation you have, thus your exposure to the gas market jumps with every increase in wind penetration. One other quick comment. We often hear that it's the incumbent fossil utilities that fight renewable energy mandates at every turn. This is Senator Seitz. He is now Mr. Glenn's peer in Ohio. He was the chair of the Ohio Senate Public Utilities Committee, termed out, now chair of the House Energy Committee. Responding to that argument that the utilities are the ones that fight this stuff, he said, "Sir, let me be clear. The utilities would make electricity through Boy Scout troops rubbing sticks together to make fire so long as they could pass the cost on to ratepayers." So let's be clear, there's a tremendous profit incentive for our incumbent utilities to preserve the in-state mandate This is a model. I asked MPSC to run a cost explanation of the regulated return on investment for a wind project. A $220 million wind plant nets them $125 million in regulated returns, plus an additional $80 million in a production tax credit. I'm not against profit, but profit is a reward for risk, and there's no risk for the utilities in this endeavor. Now I've got to jump. The jobs thing, let me. If we're going to mandate renewable energy for jobs creation, then let's be really aggressive and mandate people to ride bicycle generators, right? I mean, that's not why we create energy or create an energy policy. Let me sum it up like this. Since energy is an overhead cost for all human activity, for all industry, then the most desirable source of energy would be a source that requires only one employee to turn the thing on and off. Now I have to jump ahead because these folks have come a long ways for me to respond to this. Wind energy is popular in our rural communities. We're often caricatured as NIMBYs. I'm going to skip over trespass zoning, but I have folks here from Sanilac County, I have folks here from Huron County, and you can see in Sanilac, which is part of the thumb, along the thumb loop, it only took 2 projects in the northern 2 townships for all those other townships to say, if that's what wind development means, that's not for me. And the red ones then zoned it out. And one of them was sued by Exelon for the attempt. In fact, Invenergy spent $164,000 on PR trying to flip just 1 township, and the people still prevailed despite spending $2,500. Tuscola County, we have...
Sorry, how much was spent?
$164,000 by Invenergy. The citizens spent $2,500. The people still prevailed. Same thing's happening in Tuscola. You see NextEra got projects in Akron, Fairgrove, Guilford, maybe a little in Wisner. The other townships saw that and said, no, not going to happen. But Columbia Township does have a project coming. That's a Consumers Energy project. The majority of their trustees, it is my understanding, have leases with Consumers Energy. And in Tuscola County, I would be remiss for not pointing out the fact that Almer and Ellington are now being sued by NextEra Energy for adopting strong zoning. And we expect them to do the same in another township in Huron County. And here is Huron County. Why are there so many turbs in Huron County? The majority of the Planning Commission members had wind leases in 2008. They adopted permissive zoning, and they believed a perpetual lie that if they zone wind out, the state will come in and force those turbines into their community by force. So Lincoln, Sand Beach, and Sherman Township decided to take matters in their own hand last year, and the result was that there was a massive countywide election that took place on May 2nd. And curiously, 4 of the 5 Lincoln Township trustees actually have DTE wind leases. They stood to benefit hugely from the financial development. Nonetheless, they looked around at the rest of their county and said, no, we will not do this. They led the fight to stop the projects. The bottom line is, well, you can see, NextEra's PAC actually ran campaign ads say, you vote no on May 2nd and we will sue your township. That's how ugly it got there. We will sue you for voting no on this, or for voting yes on this new restrictive zoning. The people fought back. They went to the streets. Here's the election results. We guess that DTE and NextEra spent somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million in this campaign. Our folks here spent $3,500. The ballot results came in 63 to, sorry, I get emotional, to 36%. In Lincoln Township, with the DTE leaseholders, it was 58 to 41. Don't ever run an ad like this unless you really want to anger the electorate, because they beat NextEra 413 to 80 in that township. Mr. Gaffney's sitting right here behind us. Do we really want energy policy that has people turning to the Lord and begging for deliverance from it? Is that really what we want? Because these people are living with 800 or 900 turbines. And that's their reality. And they're here today because they feel that with the 100 paid energy lobbyists who walk these halls every day, I heard Liesl say, she's already been to most of your offices. I took the day off work. I can't be here to be in all your offices. That our voices are not being heard. Well, my point is this. We've arrayed 2 irresistible forces with energy policy. The utilities have a mandate they have to meet, and our people have local control zoning, and it is being used ever more aggressively. And I don't know how that resolves itself, but if there's any attempt to remove local control of zoning, these problems will shift from our township halls to your hearing rooms. So I now pause for questions.
Representative Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony today. Obviously, you know this issue quite substantially and have a significant interest in it, and thank you for all of you who are here today. I wanted to press you a little bit on the issues related to private property rights. So you pointed to 400 and some odd foot wind turbine in parts of townships and near homes and things like that. You know, if my neighbor wanted to put up a taller flagpole or a structure that I objected to in some way because I found it unsightly, at what point do my property rights, I guess, bleed over into my neighbor's property rights? And I can understand some of your concerns, but I'm interested to know, if we protect private property and somebody wants to put something on their private property, what right do I have as a neighbor to object to that, and how do we fit all those together?
Well, under Michigan zoning law, we have broad right to object.
Right, but I mean...
And so, if you look at this picture here, this is a map of a wind project in Sanilac County. It's hard to see, but there are circles around each turbine location. I will zoom in. And it's harder to see, but the three parcels in the middle are gray. That means they do not have a wind lease. The green ones on each side do have leased property. So if you can see the faint orange circles, those are the setback distances set into zoning. And in this zoning, the zoning that is demanded by the wind industry, the noise levels and the setback distances are measured at the neighboring home, not the property line. So as a result of not signing a lease, this fellow in the middle, those setback circles now cover 50% of his private property. They've sharply impeded his ability to ever develop that property. They've certainly taken away from him his right for ever developing a wind turbine, because the neighbors now have them. And our whole point, and the point I make in my zoning, is that they're demanding an uncompensated nuisance and safety easement, and it's being forced upon the non-leaseholders by the fiat power of zoning law. We think that property lines should be respected, and if they want an easement like any other company, like a pipeline or transmission company, they can acquire that easement through private negotiation.
Okay, now what about if, for example, in that instance you showed there, someone moved into that gray parcel from the city of Lansing. They move out, and the neighbors around them are running farm equipment late at night when they're out doing their harvest, things like that. We have a Right to Farm Act in Michigan to protect people who are in rural areas who are doing farming activities.
That's right.
They may cause a disturbance to their neighbor. Wouldn't you agree with that? I mean,
but they're protected, and the townships have no ability to regulate that.
Right, they are protected in that regard because they are using the full use of their property as they choose to farm and everything else. Now they certainly should be considerate and everything else. There are rules that take place, but in general, you would not be able to say, well, my neighbor, I smelled an offensive odor coming from my neighbor's property because they're conducting agricultural operations, and I moved in next door. Does a wind turbine kind of, I guess, act similarly than that, where a neighbor could be opposed or offended by it, but it still belongs to the property rights of the person where that tower resides?
Well, we regulate all the time billboards for size because they're a visual blight, and they're only 50, 60 feet tall, and they don't spin and make noise. So it's very normal and typical to regulate large, noisy structures. And in this case, the wind industry asked for a type of zoning that no other industry demands that I'm aware of. They don't come in and ask that we rezone one parcel. They ask to rezone an entire township or even an entire county. So of course that enjoys an additional layer of scrutiny. Secondly, most of those townships had existing height ordinances in place for all structures of 50 or 60 feet, with maybe the exception of a leg elevator or a church steeple. They don't come in and ask that we raise that to 65. They ask that we raise it to 600, as Apex has done in Shiawassee County. So it's a very normal thing to regulate large, noisy structures. And as we say, just because your development project requires you to force a size 12 foot into a size 9 shoe doesn't mean that we have to surrender our loss of amenity of our homes in exchange for your return on investment.
Okay, and I just want to make sure I'm not, trying to disrespect your opinion. I just want to make sure that we are protecting individual private property rights of people who own land and things like that. And obviously we respect zoning as well, but at the same time, we've got to find a way of addressing both. I think local zoning protections as well as private property rights and things of that sort.
I will say that I speak on wind zoning all across the country, and many folks have sat in a position like yours and saying there has to be some way to make this work peaceably. The problem is the wind industry has an issue of scale. Turbines were 250 feet tall, then 390, then 500, now 600. At some point, does it not just become obviously ludicrous that a 1,000-foot turbine doesn't fit in anybody's backyard anywhere within 4 or 5 miles? I mean, this problem is not going away. And like I say, there's no way to be a little bit pregnant. You either have a turbine in your community and it's totally altered your lifestyle, or you do not. And to split that baby in the middle has not readily been done anywhere in the country that I know of.
Okay. And now, just one last question: what's the typical decibel level of say a 450-foot turbine?
107 decibels at the source.
Okay. And from the setback, how much would it be?
Well, if you're talking low frequency noise like DBC, which is the most problematic, we're recording at 60, 70 decibels inside the house.
And that's equivalent to what, I guess, like a
It's
vacuum
equivalent
cleaner?
to your neighbor's kid having an 18-inch subwoofer in the back of his Cavalier bumping music all night long.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
A friend of mine does the honor guard at Detroit Lions Stadium. I think he said the loudest they got was when they introduced the survivor of Pearl Harbor, and it was about 100 and somewhere just over 100.
And to be sure, in the hearing ranges, we see 50 to 60 decibels on people's property. But remember, annoyance affects your ability to use your property, and these people are used to noise levels in their communities of only 25 decibels. For decades, the environmental movement has fought to declare noise a pollutant, and now suddenly they want to give it a pass because it's coming from a wind turbine that typically is 50 miles from the urban center where they actually live. They're the NIMBYs, not us. If Mayor Hartwell would require 100% renewable energy to be generated within the city limits of Grand Rapids, that would be great. But I dare say if we built 25, 50-story tall turbines in Grand Rapids, in Ann Arbor, in Lansing, in Bloomfield Hills, this project would have been done a long time ago. Nobody would take it.
Mr. Martis, I saw one of the folks I think is with you raise their hand. Somebody else has a comment.
Just a real quick comment.
You can come up to the microphone, but before you do, sir, we'll have you identify yourself, but have a seat. Representative LaFave, you had a question?
I'm Robert Gaffney from...
Robert, if you would hold on just a second. Representative LaFave's got a question, then we'll hear from you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may, I'd like to ask a couple brief questions on Delta County.
Sure.
So I have the honor and privilege of representing Delta County in the Upper Peninsula, and some of the individuals that I spoke to in Garden Peninsula described themselves as the armpit of Delta County, and they feel as though the county laws regulating zoning kind of left them off to the waypoint. So if you would, briefly describe what happened in the Garden Peninsula, and also, if you could, answer my question. We were told that adjacent property owners were given money for their allowance of the turbine to go in there, but my understanding is they only get that money if they sign a release where they're not allowed to sue for noise pollution or any other issues, and if they are a holdout, that they don't get any of that money regardless of if their property is inside of that circle.
That's exactly right. There is no automatic payment of neighbors, none. You have to accept it, and when you sign that good neighbor agreement, you sign a gag order that prevents you from taking any action against the wind developer. In exchange, you get about $3 a day. And so yes, there's deep turmoil in the Garden Peninsula with multiple lawsuits between Heritage Sustainable and people and the township. There's been physical violence. It's really an awful scene. It's one of the few places I've gone in the state where I actually worry about my safety, and I don't feel that way in most other places. But that's the reality there. And getting back to Representative DeAnda's point about, I think he brought it up about the Great Lakes, I think there's a little misunderstanding there. Heritage Sustainable built their project on the Garden Peninsula before there was any wind zoning. Fish and Wildlife wrote strongly worded letters saying we do not recommend that this project be constructed on the Garden Peninsula, not because it's offshore, but because it's within 3 miles of the Great Lakes shoreline. And Fish and Wildlife recommends for the protection of endangered species and migratory birds a 3-mile setback distance from the Great Lakes shoreline across the entire Great Lakes basin. And we tried to get Delta County to put that into law. They would not. And the state has said, go back to your county. The county says, let the state do it. So if we were to ever support any state intervention into local control of wind zoning, we think a 3-mile Great Lakes shoreline setback is perfectly agreeable and reasonable for this pure Michigan state, because Fish and Wildlife has no enforcement authority to do anything about it. They were warned not to build, and Heritage built anyways.
Is it Robert?
Yes.
Robert, you would identify yourself and whatever you have to say.
Yep, I'm Robert Gafke. I'm from Bloomfield Township in Huron County, and I'll try to keep it very brief. My story begins with Heritage Sustainable, the same ones that built in the Garden Peninsula, came into my area, offered me and my wife repeatedly for 2 years pursued us to get us to sign a wind lease. We repeatedly refused, and the wind turbines were put up regardless behind my house in a phase 2 project. I filed a complaint against Heritage Energy because it sounds like you're living on the end of an airport most days. Anyway, serious noise problems. And their solution to the problem was to have Rick Wilson from Heritage Energy, vice president, roll into my driveway with a wind energy lease to sign. And if I would have signed that lease on the back, and if you guys want to know what the real interference and effects of it is, get a Heritage lease, and I'll supply you with a copy. It says if the grantor, which would be me, signs the wind lease, I can't do anything about audio, visual, electromagnetic, view. The list goes on of about 12 interference and of effects that a wind turbine causes on a neighboring property. So those are real things that the developer themselves put into that document that I could never lay a claim to sue them or do anything about if I had signed that wind lease. And now in Huron County, because we had a pro-wind planning commission that set ineffective ordinances and are also at this time letting Heritage Energy choose the acquisition who they've been in bed with, which is Epsilon and Associates. They want them to do the sound testing. I have refused, and we have a big problem in Huron County, and it needs to be fixed or there's going to be big problems. Thank you.
Robert, thank you. Vice Chair Lisinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as we're looking at our energy portfolio, and you're making different points about cost and availability for wind, I think those are very complicated questions, and as a person who values math and data, I found a lot of your numbers were kind of jumping around on different basis points. So if we were just to take a step back, and what we've heard over and over from folks outside and folks inside is that businesses are trying to make the best choices for their businesses based on energy production cost. Do you feel that the energy mandate is driving the growth of wind, or is that the decreasing cost of wind, its stability, and the desirability of renewable energy is driving the cost of wind? Do you think businesses are making inherently bad decisions for themselves in choosing wind energy?
No, I think Steelcase made a wise choice when they bought wind energy from Oklahoma at $20 instead of from Michigan at $60.
Okay, so wind energy at $60, and this is where some of the different prices that are jumping around is this idea of the levelized cost of energy, so kind of that full-in cost of energy, and we know that we're subsidizing oil and gas and that we're subsidizing different types of production. So can you explain to me the difference between the $25 or the $25 wholesale cost and then the $60, I think you called it a levelized cost of energy cost? What's the difference between a wholesale and a levelized cost of energy?
The levelized cost of energy is when you take into the cost of the structure versus plus financing plus O&M and add into it the expected generation, how much is the electricity going to cost coming out of that device. So yes, you'll see studies by Lazard, for instance, those studies are pushed around here a lot that say that wind is now down around 3 cents. But that can't possibly be true in Michigan because subsidized wind in Michigan is selling for 4.5 to 6 cents, and unsubsidized is somewhere between 7 and 9. So the levelized cost numbers are used as a way to confuse you over the basic fact that our wind resource is inherently expensive and uncompetitive with windy parts of the state. And so they want to talk in national numbers and obscure the fact that Michigan regionally numbers are off the chart. The great thing is my numbers are coming from the Public Service Commission, and our power purchase agreements are signed in public. So we know that Detroit Edison is selling for $60. We know Heritage is selling for $104. So my question would really be to them, why, if the levelized cost of unsubsidized wind energy is only 3 cents, are you charging us 6, 8, 10 after a subsidy worth 3 cents?
So therein lies my issue. That was a lot of different numbers thrown into the same pot. And so I think we're going to have to agree to dive into this deeper at another time, because when we're talking about the differences between the 3 cents and the retail market of 4.5 cents, those are driven by much different factors than simply what I believe you're trying to imply, which is a usurious desire for profit. I believe these cost numbers are much more complicated than what are being presented here, and I'm uncomfortable with $25, $45, $60, and $70 per kilowatt hour when they're using different basis points for their calculation. So I will dive into your materials and look further
Mr.
into
Martis,
that.
we'll allow you to respond next time.
Yeah.
Okay.
Vice Chair Lisinski, appreciate your comments. Need a motion to excuse absent members. Vice Chair Lisinski so moves. Without objection, so ordered. Energy Policy Committee stands adjourned.